All right, recording. We're here.
And we are live.
Good afternoon. I was gonna say morning, but we're way past morning at this point. So
Yeah, morning's come
Yeah.
and gone.
it's still on that, waiting on that coffee to kick in. Just kidding.
Uh,
How's
It's
how's
funny, I
everybody
almost
been?
got another cup of coffee today, and I was like, you know what? I don't want to be awake till 2 o'clock in the
Bouncing off the
morning.
walls.
yeah, I've made that mistake one too many times.
Only if
uh,
you're in some deep code state, right? You're just gaming away, hacking away, doing your thing, being in the zone, but not on a regular day.
no,
Too much.
yeah. Well, then you're up until 3 in the morning, and then you're feeling it the next day. That's for sure.
I
Well, hey,
hear that.
welcome to episode 32. We just had to double check the count. So yeah, we're cranking along. We're in our 30s now, and it's good to see everybody again. It's been, I think, a little bit of a time in between here on these, but it's good to be back and got some interesting topics we want to kind of go through and cover a few things and just have some good conversation.
Absolutely.
So Sandy, why don't you start? Which one do you want to kind of start us off with today? You want to do Spring4Shell? That was kind of top of mind for you,
Yeah,
or
yeah. I think that's the one that's kind of been making its rounds, and we're starting to see kind of the weaponization of it. For those that don't know, new vulnerability called Spring4Shell that was reported on the very popular Java framework Spring Core on JDK 9 plus. Basically, this is an open source framework used to easily build, MVC applications, Java-based applications, and whatnot. And essentially, hackers have found a way to, by sending specially crafted HTTP requests, exploit certain configurations, non-default configurations. So we can jump into that in a second, but to essentially perform remote code execution. And as you can imagine, with that comes a whole slew of potential impact. But yeah, if execution of this is leading to stuff like total compromise of hosts and containers that are running the framework. Um, and we'll jump a little bit into it more, but it's as a result leading to rapid deployment of botnet malware like Mirai. So yeah, pretty nasty stuff.
this is a pretty high ranking, right? Like a 10 out of 10 basically, or like 9.9
I,
essentially.
I think the only thing keeping it from being a 10 out of 10 is the fact that there are some requirements in order to exploit it. Like you have to have JDK 9 or higher. It has to be packaged as a WAR file. And then you need the Spring Web MVC and then Spring Web Flux dependencies for it to properly execute. But otherwise, because of the velocity of exploitation, the ease of use, or the ease of availability of the code, it's still ranked rather high. It's just it has to have those certain configs enabled for exploitation, and that's what kind of brings it down a little bit below the full 10 out of 10 criticality.
I think I saw that from this perspective, like it can be even executed against like serverless and, more containerization type as well, right? Not just, pure web servers, if you will, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you could basically do so by through simple curl commands or even through something like Burp Suite. You're able to write to various folders directly on the file system. So as a result, yeah, you're pretty much bypassing that OS layer, and you're able to execute this against, like you said, serverless containers or serverless applications and various containers located within the cloud. So that's why this is, I believe, there were a few Amazon services that were directly affected by this, as well as a few Azure ones as well. I don't have
Don't
those on the
don't worry,
top of my
Sammy.
head.
There's still a server underneath there somewhere.
Right.
Magic. Yeah.
So I think I heard something key that was mentioned, that this is open source.
Right.
Is
Right.
that correct? Yep.
Yeah,
So
it's an
we're
open source
seeing that
framework.
kind of pop out again. So the community, it's got to rapidly get something put together, and then you got to start evaluating that, make sure that that patch is appropriate to even put back into your environment.
Yeah. Shades of Log4j, certainly, right? Popular open source framework, rapidly deployed on a lot of large scale commercial platforms and cloud-based services, and yeah, as a result, that's why the potential impact is so high.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of that still, right? Like you said, these wide scale, platforms out there, like we saw it with Log4j, we're seeing it with this. And these things are, just out there rampant, right? I mean, a lot of devices and services and software run these types of things. So we're going to continue to kind of see this trend, I think, of these, widespread, packages that are vulnerable. And to your point, Brian, like, how do you know the patch you're installing is still good? Going to have that kind of good QA in there, right? And what that's looking for. And this is a good time to really understand, hey, what's my attack surface from the outside as well as the inside? And, you know, who's out there scanning from like a showdown perspective, looking for vulnerabilities, looking for this type of stuff. And just kind of leads into this continued cat and mouse patching life cycle we so often see out there.
That's
Yep.
right. Yeah, and for the record, they have released a set of patches for the vulnerability. So for those that haven't, those are available. I think up versions 5.3.18 and then 5.2.2 and higher should be unaffected by the vulnerability. So in the interim, you can disallow. You can maintain a disallow or block list in the web app firewall for strings that contain values like class dot star and whatnot, and that should provide some a short-term mitigation. Also downgrading, because like we mentioned earlier, JDK 9. So if you downgrade to JDK 8, you can also mitigate the impact. So two potential workarounds in the short term, while we start to kind of find out more about the vulnerability. But in the meantime, we're seeing that it's allowing threat actors to download the Mirai sample to the temp folder of a lot of the systems that are hosting the framework, and then as a result, you can execute it after changing permissions of the Mirai payload itself. And we've seen this, I think, more commonly in the eastern part of the world. I think Singapore is where we're seeing this deployed the most rapidly. But yeah, we can see that it's currently being weaponized and actively exploited in the wild by large, by major APTs and whatnot.
Yeah, it's going to take a minute for everybody to kind of get their patch. It's interesting what you said about kind of downgrading as a workaround, if you will. So usually it's the other way around. Like, hey, we're saying go upgrade, patch this and that. But in some cases, like that's a valid, workaround, assuming your application will still function. Or do you take that risk of saying, hey, maybe I lose XYZ functionality, but I'm preventing a major breach? It's probably worth it in some cases, right? So again, it's that mix of kind of business needs versus risk and what you want to take on. But these are things that you can do to kind of be creative and working backwards, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it really, it depends on like the exposure of the application. I mean, if it's publicly facing and then publicly accessible, it might be
Sure.
better to downgrade while you're still waiting for the vendor to roll out the patch, as opposed to waiting around with that live vulnerability in the environment. So yeah, it makes sense in certain circumstances for sure. You just have to make sure that what you're downgrading to hopefully is not vulnerable with some other vulnerability as well, right? There's a reason why it was patched.
Making it even worse sometimes.
Right.
But you downgrade and then you don't patch to the latest version of the downgrade, and because oftentimes they don't release a patched version of the full installer to downgrades. Got to think about that a little bit. But then the cloud brings something up with all of this, right? When you look at platform as a service, maybe you don't have control over patching this because you've given that off to one of these providers now, whether it's GCP, AWS, Azure, etc. So what do you do in those type of scenarios to help protect yourself?
Right. Yeah. And I think, with what it comes down to that is working with those vendors directly to understand what they're doing to kind of ensure data security and security of their own platform. And in the case of SaaS based applications, their application, right? Because it's really just the data that we're hosting at that point. And then understanding the various configurations and security settings that come with that are provided to you as the end user, that come with the platform that you're responsible for managing. I think that's a lot of where these issues kind of arise is as you start to move the shift of responsibility model. It's difficult to interpret as a security engineer what is in scope for your administration, what controls are in scope, right? And understanding that's probably a big gap that we have right now. Often we see that a lot of elements or many parts of the organization have too much access to too many parts of the platform or software, and as a result, we increased exposure, of course, and it inevitably just increases the attack surface, right?
Yep. You can't just slide the credit card and say, I'm handing it all over, right? We talk about this in the past, but it's a shared responsibility model.
Exactly.
Across this. So I think that's one of the key things to remember in these type of events. And hopefully you've already done your third-party risk assessment and you understand what data is up in the cloud and you understand what their response process is as well.
Yeah, I think, Brian, you bring up a good point. Is people kind of, I want to say, ignore, kind of choose to ignore, kind of just forget about the shared responsibility model, and whether it's a PaaS or SaaS and things like that, they're all a little bit different. But at the end of the day, you as the consumer of those platforms or systems have to ultimately know what are you signing legally. I mean, there's very lengthy MSAs in place, and it's interesting from our perspective. Like when we're helping customers with SaaS platforms or even like SaaS software, more and more people now are asking for the contracts. They're reviewing in detail who is responsible for what, who, if a breach happens, who's paying for what, what's the insurance cover, what the premium is going to be, things like that. So I think people now are kind of looking at this as like, hey, I have to do what I can. Maybe not from a technology standpoint because you're kind of limited or given like a certain subset of keys, if you will, to make changes. But how do you protect the business from any legal obligation and a compliance, and who puts the risk on what? And a lot of companies use these platforms because they don't want to deal with the risk. They want to say, hey, you know what? I take the risk in making it somebody else's problem, and then putting more trust that they can build a better system than potentially they can, or the price is right. Like we see a lot with, like, let's just say SOC as a service versus building your own. So it's a good example. It's often extremely expensive to build your own SOC team and the right tooling and this and that. Whereas if you outsource some of the visibility, okay, great, it's something you can look into. So it's almost like these, I think the article you're referring to, it even kind of talks about these SaaS providers as like these operating systems, right? I mean, Salesforce is probably a great example, or like QuickBooks, right? You're putting a lot of your accounting data, your CRM data, all these things in somebody else's hands, and you ultimately have to kind of audit, trust, and trust but verify what they're doing, and how do you hold these people accountable. So it's a great kind of a cat and mouse game of shifting. I don't want to say blame when things happen, but shifting who's responsible for what from that
Yeah.
perspective.
And I think that Atlassian thing that's gone on, I'm sure you guys have been reading about that, where all that data's gone. It wasn't necessarily a cyber attack, but it's an availability issue. And then the ability to restore that, some of these people would be 4+ weeks before they have it back up and running. So handing it off to the cloud doesn't just mean it's gone and you don't have to worry about it. I mean, stuff happens, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point back to what you were kind of saying, Derek, about the shifting responsibility. I think a lot of it is accountability and standardization. Right now, there's not a lot of standards across application to application. It's hard enough to create kind of generalized standards for environments and general controls, but then breaking that down further into vendor specific applications, and then the standard level of hygiene for each of these applications is not something that exists. You might find some control checklist for pretty major vendors like O365 or something of that nature, but some of these smaller third-party SaaS providers, who's creating the standard for what the control should be, and what controls should be available for management by the client himself. So I think as the ecosystems grow, we'll start to see baskets of major vendors starting to form kind of a baseline standard, and certain things are pretty common amongst all platforms, right? Like 2FA, or just proper IAM. So these types of things can be easily standardized, and then that provides the security engineers who are managing these things something to work off of. And so potentially that could be a way for the industry to improve as a whole, is to start to document and create these standards.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to that, right? It's really up to the end user of these systems and platforms to like ask these questions, ask for these documents. I'll give you a good example. We have a customer, they're doing like a very robust kind of POS platform rollout right now, an upgrade, if you will, and kind of putting it it's in the third party. And they asked this third party, like, hey, let me see your kind of SOC 2, Type 2 governance compliance and things like that. And they looked around like, well, what's that? And then they basically try to kind of give the underlying cloud provider's platform as their own. And it was like, well, that's some major red flags right there. Like, why don't you audit your own data and this and that? So it was like, these are the things that now people have to kind of take into account as that governance and risk side of things is playing a bigger and bigger role in cybersecurity. And that's almost a topic in itself, right? The technical controls and sometimes the governance controls can maybe battle and butt heads a little bit, but ultimately at the end of the day, they're both responsible to like the board or the executive team to reduce the risk of the business overall. And I think we're going to see compliance and governance take a bigger role in this in the future and kind of really help drive a lot of the technical decisions probably that come out of IT, in my opinion. So that could be a whole nother conversation in itself.
Well said. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
I tend to agree with everything you said. Yeah.
Cool. Let's see. Another one that was kind of interesting is kind of coming up right now is FBI is kind of warning of the agricultural sector kind of heightened right now from a ransomware attack perspective. So I think, we talked about, kind of the water systems. We talked about the energy system. We talked about oil and gas. And I know we kind of hinted at this before on the show about, kind of food and things like that. But, now we're kind of seeing this more brought to light. And, all these critical things are potential targets, right? I mean, everything we do from a farming perspective is, very high tech now at this point, automated robots and the feeds and when do you plant seeds and this and that. And, I can imagine if these systems that are down that, know when to water crops or how to do certain things can cause, major disruption here to, the food supply. And that has a real world physical effect on us, right? So it just shows that this is another example of how something that's, digital or cyber in a way can affect the lives of like, real people. So it's definitely top of mind and something people need to be aware of out there.
Yeah, it's not just like an ice storm in the southeast where you can't get milk, egg, and bread,
Yeah.
right? This is a prolonged period of years to recover from something like that. And then you think about what's going on in the world right now, China doing all these lockdowns to get COVID out. Well, the workers can't go because they're not allowed to go out and about. I understand it's the cities under lockdown right now, but the point is maybe some of those farm workers are in those cities. You never know, right? Or the war that's going on, they can't export all those crops. Or just even last week on spring break, driving through Imperial Valley, and there's all of these farms that nothing's growing because there's not enough water supply that's coming in. So they're having to make decisions now what's going where. So just imagine what a ransomware attack would do to something like that and the whole supply.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the gangs, it makes sense because they're trying to go after low-hanging fruit, and technically speaking, they should be kind of executing this at a high volume. The reason for that is well, at least their ideology, I imagine, is they want to go after the environments with the least amount of standardization and hygiene in terms of their controls, but at the same time with the highest amount of impact in the
Yeah.
event of a downtime.
Hmm.
The type of impact that isn't a might do, but a must do, something like Colonial Pipeline. It's like, where is the standards that surround critical infrastructure? There are none. But at the same time, well, they're starting to kind of be created. But that's at the same time, if that organization goes down, you saw the impact of that and what the real world impact of that is. So it makes for a prime target for ransomware gangs because it's like, well, instead of going after an organization like Google or whoever that may be, large scale organization, who of course they'll negotiate, they'll probably work with the ransomware gangs and potentially pay the ransom or have
Yeah.
a higher need to remediate the issue. they're going after these lower hygiene organizations that still have that same high requirement for remediation. So it's a perfect business model for them. And when they do that at volume, I can start to see why that we're starting to see it in high volume in industries like healthcare, public services, or the public sector, as you're alluding to, and then critical infrastructure. So yeah, it definitely makes sense.
Yeah, and think about those control systems, right? They're running all Windows XP, right? They're probably not upgraded. A lot of them probably aren't patched and updated. And I know my wife's aunt in Nebraska, they just got fiber a couple years ago. And so there's this big push to connect all these farms together. And so you have 5G, you have the fiber. So now they're plugging these things in. They don't necessarily have a network person or a cybersecurity person that plugs these systems in. Now they're exposed to all of this, right?
Configurations, default passwords, non-patch
Exactly.
systems.
It's admin, I guarantee it, right? Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they have their phones, so they can now go and just, oh yeah, I can turn the water on or off because it rained today, right? And so that opens up even more holes because it is admin to log into the app.
Yeah, I think to your point, Brian, it's like, IT and kind of cybersecurity for some of these industries becomes like a very like afterthought, right? Like their primary goal is like the crops, the food, getting the water, the seeds, farming equipment, all that kind of stuff. And IT is like, kind of like where it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Like it was like a nice to have in most industries. Now it's like a must have. And I think farming and agriculture is kind of catching up to like, hey, it's becoming like a must have, but who's managing it, right? And I think one of the things too we see a lot of is there's probably specialized MSPs out there that like might have a niche in, let's say, agriculture, right? But it also means that there's still prime targets for, threat actors to kind of go after from that perspective because they might have easy access and keys to these, various farms and water districts and, things like that. So again, everything kind of becomes this prime target of, directly and through supply chain in a way perspective. So scary stuff.
It's like it's famineWare. Or
there you go. I like that.
Oh, that's a new name. Go trademark
you got to
that.
trademark
Hurry.
that right now, real quick.
It's not bad, right? Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. I'll get the domain right now.
Yeah.
Let me download this and go ahead and go grab it. No.
Yeah. Good thing this isn't live. We're just recording it, right? Just kidding.
But it's such a good point because like who thinks about that, right? It's at first you're like, oh, what is the potential impact of local farm going down? But then when you realize it creates issues in the food supply chain, you realize the urgency that's required when an event happens that it does bring their systems down. So yeah, it's just not as obvious as say attacking some Fortune 500 company, but I think at volume you definitely it's very it's very impactful, or rather, it's very lucrative. I think that's the word I was looking for. Yeah,
It's
very
almost like this like out of sight, out of mind. Like what I mean by that is like, like for all of us here, we all live in like a, major city, et cetera. Like there's buildings around and like we don't really see farms, right? We're not like in the Midwest where you drive by and see farms every day. So you kind of don't think about it, right? I mean, I know I don't like obviously like, like you can go get food and buy food, but most people don't think about where does it come from? How does it get to me? Like from beginning to end. So because you don't really see it every day, like you don't think it's a high target, but it's like you guys were saying, it's an extremely effective target. I mean, it's a easy barrier to entry in some cases, but extremely high impact, right? So it makes it a very valuable target in like a military type language, I would say, right?
Exactly.
Totally agree.
And I think kind of on that same note, there was an interesting kind of update to a Conti and the whole healthcare thing, kind of speaking of ransomware, right? I know they were pretty big about saying, hey, we're not targeting, healthcare. It wasn't part of our like creed and this and that, but kind of have some reports have come out that it was like, well, that was said one thing, but, really a different thing under the hood, I guess, trust no one in those kind of cyber gangs, things like that. Right?
I think that was mostly like their short-term PR, right? They're just them trying to garner or
hey, don't look over here.
Exactly, trying to avoid getting the drone strike. But it's healthcare is another perfect example of what we're talking about, where it's that low barrier to entry, high impact environment. where they're gonna cooperate to get their systems back online, but at the same time there are no standards really that holding them to a higher level of hygiene. Like we've talked about it with Josh, I think a few episodes back with when we were talking about HIPAA and the shortcomings of the standard and how it really doesn't speak to any kind of intensive testing or really any kind of high intensity controls. And as a industry like healthcare, you would think that that wouldn't be the case. So we're really behind in that regard, and so it's not a surprise to me that you see such a high volume of ransomware games continue to target these industries like that, agriculture, and even education,
Hmm.
where there's really nothing around there right now.
Scary stuff. And then yeah, I think hospitals are the other interesting one because like the whole IoT, right? You have various pumps and machines and Brian, to your point, running Windows XP, running Windows whatever, can't patch it because they don't exist anymore, and you have to kind of just deal with it, right? And healthcare can be, physically life and death situation. So that one's probably a little bit more visible, but again, very nasty from a high impact perspective, and what can really be damaged out there.
Yep, I'm hearing more and more that hospitals and healthcare they are now practicing their BCP plans, and they're doing their downtime procedures to make sure that their staffs know. Because if you think about it, the younger generations, they don't know pen and paper,
Yeah.
right? Everything they've done's always been charting on a computer and all that type of stuff. So the older generation, no problem. They get out a pen and pad and they take all their notes and they can go put it in the system when it comes back up, per se. So I think you're seeing a lot of that. At least I've read several articles recently where they're starting to really practice those things so they are prepared in that type of environment. It's not just a 4-hour downtime. They're preparing for a week on end type of scenario.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to our testing of the backups, right? I mean, on that same along, test your DR, test your BCP, run those simulations, run the downtime, and it's worth it to take that time out to practice these things. As we say, practice makes perfect in a lot of cases, and it needs to happen in kind of cyber kung fu and your digital resilience to these things, so that you're not caught off guard, and like if and when things happen, it doesn't shock and awe. It's more of a hey, look, this happened. Execute the plan. Let's move forward and do what we can do best and get out of the situation.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's good to start seeing them take that approach of high maturity organizations and really start to do the tabletop exercises, do the simulations, do the testing, and hopefully with that the standards will change, because unfortunately it's since an industry like healthcare and is so standard driven, you really need those to improve for the industry to improve. As an engineer, I understand. I tend to fall more on the side of controls, and remediating those controls and fixing those controls. But I think the improvement of the controls themselves and the policy around them is probably something that an industry, a not so technical industry like healthcare, probably needs. So hopefully with what you guys are mentioning, we start to see big players do this as a standard, and as a result, a waterfall effect to the rest of the industry, and hopefully it becomes by default that we're performing these things.
Very cool. So guys, with that, any kind of closing thoughts besides like, subscribe, follow us on the various social media platforms we got going on?
Yeah, definitely do, and we'll be back to talk about more hot stuff in cybersecurity next time.
Yeah, and if you guys have any cool topics you guys want us to cover, please leave them as a comment, and we'd be happy to talk through them.
Right on. All right, everybody.
Sounds great.
Take care.
All right, see ya.
Bye.
All right, guys.
Take care.